Okay, I think I'm on. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Bennett, the Research Manager at the Royal Armouries, and welcome to the 8th talk in our winter lecture series. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you for the 7th, particularly because 2021 is a special year for the UK's National Collection of Arms and Armour. It marks 25 years since the museum's new purpose design site in Leeds opened, and although any commemorations of this are likely to be somewhat muted under the circumstances, it's still an anniversary worth marking. Certainly something that I'd like to highlight as someone who was at primary school in Leeds when the site opened and whose subsequent path into both academia and eventually to the museum was in large part inspired by having a national museum on my doorstep. If you'd like to keep tabs on our site's reopening, whether that's Leeds, London or Portsmouth, or if you'd like to get closer to the collection through our online catalogue, please go to our website, which is royalarmouries.org. Now, as always, there'll be a question and answer session after the talk. If you're watching on YouTube, please type your question in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're watching via Zoom, you'll find a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can type questions. And as always, while I can't guarantee to get through them all, we'll cover as many as we can. With the necessary preparation out of the way, therefore, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Emma Levitt. Emma's research focuses on the interaction between masculinity, kingship, chivalry and the tournament from the last Plantagenet to Henry VIII. Her work has appeared in venues from the BBC History magazine to the Museum of London, and you'll shortly be able to see more of it in the Medieval Warfare magazine, the Tudor Society magazine, and in Bloomsbury's Cultural History of Sport series. And today's talk is going to explore these themes with particular reference to the court of Henry VIII. Without any further ado then, Emma Levitt.
Thank you, Mark, for that glowing introduction. I've got a nice jousting heraldic sign behind me there, so you can look at something a little bit more interesting than me. And I'm sporting today my lucky jousting t-shirt from a good friend of mine. I appreciate everybody that's logged on this afternoon. I know we're all a little bit zoomed out, but hopefully you'll find this entertaining and it'll brighten up your Thursday afternoon. So I'm going to dive straight in today. So the medieval tournament in Henry VIII's reign continued to be an important arena for men to showcase their martial prowess as they entered into the tiltyard to perform feats of arms. Now, this competition was really fierce, and Henry was not excused from defeat because he was king. And that's one of the first things that I want to sort of clear up today. In fact, it was essential for his masculine image that his matches were viewed as hard-fought battles. Now, in the tiltyard, manhood was judged according to skill, not status. So for a man to successfully perform his masculinity, he was expected to follow a definite set of rules and a unique scoring system. And this ranked men in terms of their knightly abilities. So a second thing really that I want to clear up as well today is that the joust by the 16th century wasn't just a case of riding down the tiltyard and unhorsing your opponent. It actually mattered where you made those hits. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the scoring system a bit later on and show you some score checks as well, which are exciting documents to have a look at. So the joust was more than just a sport for Henry. It was actually a vital part of his kingship, and it's too often been overlooked and treated as a bit of a trivial hobby. But Henry VIII modelled his kingship on a particular version of chivalrous masculinity. And this was based on the archetype of the medieval knight. And I'll speak a little bit more about this model in a second. But there's been lots of discussion about how Henry, as a maturer king, looked to models such as King Solomon and King David and tried to emulate more of these religious icons, but actually the knight remained a really important part for Henry VIII. So for Henry, this knightly image was more than just an ideal. It was actually an active ideology, and it was essential that men in the 16th century still demonstrated proficiency in arms. And this does call into question as well, something else that I want to approach in this paper, is this idea that whether the medieval ages was over by the time we get to Henry VIII's reign. A lot of historians have kind of coined this period as the early modern period. But Henry didn't look to do anything different or new. He very much looked back to his medieval ancestors. He was inspired by Henry V and his war efforts in France. Edward IV, his grandfather, who held magnificent tournaments in his reign as well. And then finally, I'm going to speak about one tournament in particular, and this is a tournament that happens in 1516 at Greenwich. And it's a really interesting episode because it shows what happens when men perhaps don't perform very well in the joust, and how this affects Henry's presentation of his own kingly masculinity. So I'm just going to start off first by outlining this knightly model and speak a little bit about masculinity and gender. So the archetype of the medieval knight actually required a particular physique. So it was not just about this performance of masculinity, and lots of times we speak about masculinity as a social construct, but there was a physical aspect about this as well, and it did proceed from men's bodies. So in order to spend long times in the saddle, jousting saddle, Noel Fallows, who's done a lot of work around jousting bodies, he says that in the Middle Ages, a man's masculinity was often defined by his well-formed buttocks, thighs and legs. Now, I'm not a jouster. I've never done jousting before. There might be some jousters from the Royal Armouries listening in, so we'll have to ask them in the Q&A how accurate that representation of a jouster's body is. But the relationship between the two is clearly self-evident, because if you have a manly body befitting the tiltyard, it already implies that a man is capable of that physical prowess because of the hours of training that had to be involved to achieve that particular physique. And so in the medieval period, manhood was still acquired through engaging in competition with other men and, importantly, successfully dominating them. The aggressive environment of the tournament was where knights reaffirmed their masculinity by performing deeds in a public setting. And I think that that's important to emphasise here, because these were events that were watched by hundreds, if not thousands of people. And if you were someone of lower status in the 16th century, this might have been one of your only opportunities to actually see the knights of the Tudor court in action, and men of nobility and the king himself. So for us, it would be the equivalent of going along to a Premiership football match, which obviously we can't do at the moment, but seeing those football stars in action. So by impressing other men at the tournament, and by positioning yourself at the top of that manly hierarchy, and this hierarchy is really important because it's different from any other hierarchy that operates outside of Henry's court, it could lead to rewards as well beyond the tiltyard. And I'm going to talk about a couple of men from non-sort of noble backgrounds who do perform well in tournaments and who are highly rewarded by Henry VIII as well. Okay, I'm just going to move on now to speak a little bit about the tournament, actually how it operated for those of you who might not know how a tournament works in the 16th century. So tournaments by the reign of Henry VIII involved three main stages of competition. So we have a joust, which was the single combat on horseback with lance, and this was over a tilt barrier in Henry's reign. And Henry prefers a variant of the joust called the joust royal, which involved tilting across the tiltyard, and this was a joust of peace with blunted lances, not sharpened lances. We also have the tourney, which I'm not going to speak about today, but this involved teams of knights on horseback using swords. And then we have the foot combat, which was combat on foot, as it's titled. So the joust was really the high point of the competition for Henry VIII. And this was really where men could demonstrate their manly prowess. It involved limited vision, it involved high speeds, heavy armour. It was difficult to make those crucial hits on a tournament horse, travelling definitely at high speeds as well, especially that moment of impact. In the reign of Edward IV, the rules for jousting had been set out, and this was because Edward IV was a keen jouster, but also because the tilt barrier had been added in the 15th century. So before the 15th century, the tilt barrier didn't actually exist. So there was nothing to stop the horses from colliding and crashing into each other. So by the reign of Edward IV, when we have that tilt barrier, we needed a new set of rules. And so Edward IV asked John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, to write down a set of rules. I'm just going to share with you now a manuscript that shows these sets of rules and how they were to be marked. So this is from the British Library, and John Tiptoft said that if you were to break a lance on the body, this would count for 1 point. If you broke a lance on the head, this would count for 2 points. If you hit your opponent, so that would be an attain, but didn't shatter the lance, that would be less than a point. But points could also be deducted. So if you were to strike your opponent below his saddle, you would lose a point. If you were to strike the tilt barrier, you would lose a point. If you were to hit your opponent's horse, you would lose a point. So this was really a framework for scoring jousting. And it's interesting that men trusted this framework as a means to score them objectively. The scores were tallied across the days of the competition by heralds. Heralds were really best positioned to do this because they were the men that wrote down the coats of arms, so they were able to recognise who all the knights were. And if you like, heralds were modern day referees to us. We can imagine that the scores might even be tallied in a bit of a scoreboard, a bit like the Premier League, and you could see the knights work their way up the scoreboard across the 2 or 3 or even a week's worth of competition. That rectangular box that you can see on your screen, it shows in there where the hits were to be marked, and on the side there you've got some dashes, and they are the courses or the times that the knights would run down the tiltyard, so how many duels they would have. So it was all set out quite well for them heralds. So in Henry VIII's reign, we only have half a dozen score checks that actually survive, even though we have at least 50 tournaments that take place across his reign. There are a few more surviving from the court of Elizabeth I, and these can all be found in the College of Arms. I'm just going to come back to me now, and I'll show you a score check a little bit later on. Okay. Okay, I'm back. So it's significant that there's no evidence, like I said, to suggest that any of these scores were contested. And what it really shows is that skill, not status, separated these men in the tiltyard, and it was a way that men could prove that they were the best type of men by making these hits. But jousting was also a martial exercise, and I get asked this question a lot: how far was it training for warfare? Well, Henry VIII had not had that opportunity to prove himself in warfare like his grandfather and also his father had done, who had won their thrones on the battlefield. So he had inherited his throne, and Henry really wanted to prove himself in warfare. And at the start of his reign, tournaments were his opportunity to do this, to prove those martial abilities. Now, even in its late medieval domesticated form, as I've set out with these rules and score checks, it was still a highly dangerous game. And it was an effective means of military training because it was not so far divorced from the realities of warfare. So it's apparent that men at arms still benefited from opportunities presented by tournaments to sharpen their military skills because there was a real threat of violence and danger. So we know that Henry would go on to have 2 jousting accidents. In 1524, he had a lance pierced inside his helmet. In 1536, famously, we know that he was knocked off his horse. He subsequently was unconscious. And there were other men at his court that had accidents. In 1526, Sir Francis Bryan, again, he had a lance that splintered his eye. And even into the 16th century, Henry II of France would die from a jousting accident. So I think it's important to make the point that when we think of tournaments, we might often think of them being something quite medieval, but actually this practice continued into the 16th and even into the 17th century as well. And so we do get that continuation of medievalism across the period, which is why I think of Henry VIII as a medieval king, because he drew on these past models. Now, the hours that Henry spent in the tiltyard were not wasted. They were at the very heart and identity of his purpose as a king. So in September 1509, only a few months after his accession, Henry is found tilting at the ring, and the Venetian ambassador writes home about this. Now, Tilting at the ring, or running at the ring, or run at the quintain is where a competitor would attempt to strike an object with his lance. And this was often a ring that was suspended from a post. And for knights, this meant that they could practice running at a target, and it practiced that aim as well. And this was in a genuine contest. So in a practice not too dissimilar from scoring jousting, whoever speared the ring with his lance the most times, after a set number of runs or courses, they would be declared the winner. And if you've ever been to the Royal Armouries Easter tournaments, they often have a run at the quintain before the main joust take place. And it is a really interesting game to watch. And also they have female knights that take part in that competition as well. So hopefully maybe next year we'll be able to see that. Likely having witnessed the expert performances of men in the tiltyard as a young man, Henry knew that he had to put in some serious practice if he was to stand a chance from jousting against them. Something else to mention here as well is that the young Prince Henry was not allowed to joust in his father's reign. Henry VII was far too protective over his only surviving male heir to allow Henry VIII, the young Prince Henry, to joust at that time. So he may have been practicing and watching these men compete at his father's court, looking on, observing, running at the quintain, but he definitely was not taking part in jousts. To Henry's advantage, he had a body that was suited to jousting. He was over 6 feet tall, he was athletic, he was muscular, he was known to tire out horses, wrestle, he was a keen hunter. And the king's manly body is also apparent through surviving suits of armour. I think when we often think about Henry VIII, we think about that Holbein image where the king is larger than life and grotesquely overweight. But actually, the young Henry VIII was very athletic and handsome. And so the surviving suits of armour, a lot of which are held at the Royal Armouries, are actually a really good material source for looking at the king's body. And although armour could be somewhat modified to give an impressive appearance, and we can see this through the king's bulging codpieces, they do tell us something about what knightly bodies were like, particularly the measurements that we can derive from the king's surviving suits of armour. So I'm just going to share with you one of the earliest suits of armour that we have of the king. And this is a silver and engraved armour. It's his field armour, and it's held at the Tower of London when the king was only 24 years old. And from the measurements, his waist measured 35 inches and his chest was 42. So all the hours that Henry spent training and competing had clearly paid off. He represented a very manly frame. And we do have some other suits of armour as well. So this is from a little bit later in his reign, from 1520, from the infamous Field of Cloth of Gold tournament, when the king is competing against the French King Francis I. Now, his suit of armour has definitely filled out, but still a manly figure. So it weighed over 42 kilos, and his waist now was 45 inches and his chest was 38 inches. But still, like I say, a manly frame. So the more time that Henry spent jousting alongside the knights in the tiltyard, the stronger bonds he also established with his men. And this facilitates the rise of jousting stars at his court. And I'm going to speak a bit more in depth about a couple of these men, but men just to flag up, and men such as Charles Brandon, Thomas Levitt, Nicholas Caro, and William Compton. And there was a few others as well. So these men, it's important to recognise, are not from noble backgrounds, but their performances in the tiltyard and their ability to embody this knightly model brings them to Henry's attention. And these men went to advance themselves significantly at Henry's court, most having been trained by seasoned jouster Henry Boucher, Earl of Essex, at his London residence, which was on Knightriders Street, and it became the centre for the education of young courtiers. And this was a commonplace route to social betterment for young men at the time. And Essex's household had an unrivaled reputation as a chivalric finishing school. So it was a bit like today, I guess, for sort of young men, the Eton of chivalric schools. And Brandon was one of the young men who I mentioned, Charles Brandon, who was trained in Essex's household. And this was during the time of Henry VII. Now, he was 7 years older than Henry, but he became something of a chivalric figure for him. And the two men would often form a team of two challengers, and they would compete against all other knights at Henry's court. Now, it is telling that Henry preferred to have Brandon on his team rather than to compete against him. It was well established early on that Brandon was perhaps the best jouster at Henry's court. And I'm going to talk now about one particular revealing episode. And this happens at Greenwich. And like I said, it's in 1516 on the 19th and 20th of May. And this was a tournament that was held to celebrate the visit of Henry's sister, Margaret, Queen of Scots. And this was an elaborate spectacle, and we had 2 days of jousts. And Henry was the captain of the challengers, so the knights that were posing the challenge. And his team was made up of the jousting elite of the Tudor court, so all the best men. So we had 3 people on his team, and these were Charles Brandon, Essex, who was the seasoned jouster trainer from the chivalric school, and Nicholas Caro. Now, the opposing team of answerers who had come to answer this challenge consisted of a dozen other jousting enthusiasts. You'll be able to see some of their names on the check in just a moment. We have 2 checks surviving from this tournament, and the first jousting check that we have is found in the College of Arms, and it is the original check that was used from this tournament, which is just unbelievable that this survives. So I'm just going to share with you this now, so you can have a look at this. Okay. So from the first day, Henry managed to win all of his 3 duels by at least 2 broken lances or more, scoring 4 points in each. In contrast, the scores of his opponents were half the amount of the king. So though on the one hand, Henry could read this as an impressive victory, it's also apparent that Henry hated to win too easily. So Henry is listed as the king. Charles Brandon is listed as the Duke of Suffolk. Then you've got the Earl of Essex, and you've got Nicholas Caro, and that's on the first column, that's the challengers. And then the second column, you've got all the different answerers there. Now, in addition to the College of Arms check, we also have a second set of results from the second day, and this is found in the British Library. Now, this score check is not the original surviving score check. It has been copied into the manuscript. But what it reveals is that Henry's matches on the second day were not the exciting duels that he had hoped for. So a series of bad runs and complete misses made for a very disappointing display. This is from the answerers. And he blamed these knights for basically reducing his final score because they failed to keep their horses close enough to the tilt barrier so that he could make contact. And so in one of the matches, he only had 1 point scored against him. And in the second match, he had no points scored against him. In a letter from an observer of the day, witnessing this, Thomas, Earl of Shrewsbury, he said that the king, to save his reputation, blamed his contestants for all being inadequate, promising never to joust again except it be with as good a man as himself. So it was vital to Henry that he should engage in real competition with skilled jousters, because in this way, if he won, his masculinity would be confirmed. So his frustration is not just about sort of petty anger. His manhood was really being undermined. Now, to make matters worse for Henry, his best friend Charles Brandon had a completely different result. Now, on the first day, I'm just going to go back to that check. He actually scored the same as Henry. So Brandon actually got 12 points on the first day. He managed to break 10 lances on the body and 1 lance broken on the head, which was more impressive than Henry getting that lance broken on the head. But the scores were equal, so they were both able to distinguish themselves on the first day. And you can see why Henry thought that Brandon was his equal in the tournament. However, on the second day, Brandon performed even better in the joust, and he scored a substantial victory over all 4 challengers. Now, Brandon ran 24 times, which is the same amount as the king, but he managed to score 18 points, whereas Henry only managed to score 13 points, so 18 versus 13. So quite a big difference there. And this result was problematic for Henry, but also for Brandon as well, because it meant that Brandon was exposed as Henry's better. Now, it seemed as long as Brandon was not beating the king in a duel, his position was safe. Brandon had both the ability to perform consistently well in the joust, but also the common sense not to outdo Henry. It was the duty of these other men in the tournament to make sure the king retained his honour, especially because Henry was meant to be measured against the best men, and these men on the second day had not proven themselves for Henry. Now, interestingly, from this point onwards, Henry and Brandon switched teams. So whereas they used to joust on the same team, Brandon now becomes one of the answerers and will only joust against Henry mainly, because Henry wants to joust against somebody who he considers his equal. And so a year later, another tournament's held at Greenwich, and the two do joust against each other, and one observer compares this match to a fight between Hector and Achilles. So it seems that Brandon was very careful to stage these contests so that Henry appeared as the victor, and also as being a result of a very hard-fought battle. So Brandon was Henry's only reliable partner in his performance of kingly masculinity. Brandon's meteoric subsequent rise at court is well documented. He made a name for himself as a jouster from the very start of Henry's reign, competing in his coronation tournament. Success in the tiltyard then brought reward in the political sphere, and in 1512 he was made a master of the horse. Now, this position was a coveted role because it meant that you were taking care and had responsibility for the king's horses, which were his prized possessions. It also meant that you accompanied Henry on all his revels and tournaments as well. In 1513, further rewards came for Brandon, and he was made a viscount. He was also then subsequently made Knight of the Garter. After his participation in the French campaign, which came because he'd already proven his martial abilities in the tournament, he then received the highest honour imaginable and became the Duke of Suffolk. He was even known as the second king during Henry's reign, a status that was confirmed when he married the king's sister, Mary, Queen Dowager of France, and this made him Henry's brother-in-law. So no other man in Henry's reign managed to rise as high as Brandon or enjoyed the continual favour of the king. A second man that I want to just talk about in closing is Nicholas Caro, and he was also on that team of challengers at Greenwich, and he was only 21 years old at the time, but he also gave a notable solo performance. And the secretary to the Venetian ambassador gives an account of a scene of Caro coming into the tiltyard with a lance some 20 feet in length and 9 inches in diameter, and ran a long way with the beam on his head to the marvel of everybody. So now we have a man who is not showcasing his masculinity through hard-fought battles and martial skill. We have a man that's just prancing around the tiltyard and showing off, and that equally was part of that performance of manhood as well. Significantly, Hans Holbein's portrait of Caro illustrates him in full jousting armour. I'm just going to show you this portrait now. So here we have him in full jousting armour, holding a lance and his sword. It's also noted that he's got his codpiece on show. So he has those large muscular shoulders, heavy armour. It's a picture of virility and strength and power. And Caro was placed into Henry's household from approximately the age of 6. And he shared the king's upbringing and education. And he mastered the skills involved in jousting, so much so that Henry built for him his own tiltyard at Greenwich, so that he can arm in there and also he could practice. Presumably he was not just practicing in there alone, but obviously alongside the king as well, enabling them as well to share and form strong bonds with each other. So this also helps to explain how Henry was soon brought to prominence at Henry's court. He too became a Knight of the Garter. And again, his participation is mainly in tournaments. No other part of Henry's reign does he have a leading role. It's interesting that out of all the courtiers at Henry's court, he's the only one, not even Brandon, was painted in jousting armour. So whereas some courtiers wanted to be known as or remembered as being pious or wealthy or scholarly, he just wants to be remembered as a celebrated hero of the tiltyard. And this is why it wasn't just a trivial hobby for these men. It was such a significant part of Henry's kingship, so much so that these men were able to rise far beyond just the trophies they got for winning these results in these tournaments, but in the actual court as well. So just to wrap all this up now, the continuation of the medieval tournament into the early 16th century demonstrates that a chivalrous version of masculinity remained essential to ideals of kingship and high status. To win reputation and renown was a principal objective for all men at Henry's court, and the tournament remained a key arena for such achievement. It celebrated the skills and virtues of that military profession. It still remained important, and to particularly those knightly classes. In studying those score checks, they reveal the results that men were able to gain, but also that attainment of manhood. They're a way of quantifying masculinity. They offer an explanation as well as to why men such as Nicholas Caro and Charles Brandon, men from non-noble backgrounds, were able to advance so high at Henry's court, which is significant because these promotions have often been left explained. They're often missing from the history books. The tournament proved to be more than a romantic game for these men and for Henry. It was an expression of his desire to be seen as a medieval king, a knight, and most important of all, a man. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
No, thank you, Emma. A really interesting talk and an interesting angle to take on the period. I'm not sure it's really strictly appropriate for me to comment on the buttocks of fellow staff members, but without naming names, there may be something to that particular observation. So the Q&A is open if you're on YouTube. In the chat, if you're on the bottom. To start us off, so you mentioned some of the sources that Henry VIII drew his ideas of masculinity, so Solomon and David, Hector and Achilles, his medieval ancestors, but are there specific written sources that Henry is drawing on to form these ideas of masculinity that tell the king how to be a man, or is it something that he's putting together himself?
Yeah, so you have this big literature that is coming through in the late medieval period that has been translated and for Henry. So a lot of the mirrors for princes that were being written that set out the conduct of, how to be a knight and how to be a man. And there's lots of these textbooks that are written for men of those knightly classes, which get widely distributed. And it's something that Henry is interested in these codes of conduct of how to behave. And they do give that model. So obviously I've touched on the more sort of physical aspect, but there is that whole courtly dimension as well about how to conduct yourself and these codes of honour. And we see a bit of that as well through the rules as well, that you can't just strike your opponent below the saddle, protecting the horses. So there is that behavioural model to it, definitely. The English Life of Henry V, that's something else that Henry has. He's looking back on those martial exploits of Henry V as well, and drawing on them. And that's why he goes off to fight war with France very early on in the reign in 1513. So yeah, these are really a how-to guide for men that get published on how to be a knight, how many times you should train, how to ride your horse. And from young men, they get taught from these textbooks up until they become part of that knightly class.
Yeah, and a question from I believe from YouTube. So was it for sort of lesser nobles as well as kings? Was it common to have training bouts immediately before big tournaments as practice, or do they sort of go just based on their existing experience?
Yeah, so you definitely, so men will be trained in households. A lot of the bigger noble households will have, I think one of the ones that I was reading had around, I think it was like 23 esquires and knightly pages. I mentioned the Earl of Essex, who had that chivalric finishing school. I guess when you, I don't know, maybe you graduate in the way that we would once you've, mastered those skills. But I mean, Brandon entered the tournament in 1501 when he was only 17. So, quite young by, I guess, our standards, but not by contemporary standards. So he, I guess, is thrown in. He has those, I guess, that practice, but he hasn't been able to, fully score and have that debut. And I guess from that, he realizes that, yeah, he is talented when he's able to score well. So I guess it's the sense that they're kind of thrown the deep end in that sense. They probably had, there's lots of, in 1507, Brandon and some friends put together like a little mini tournament. So you must have had nobles who set up private events that we maybe are not recorded in the same way as the big large scale ones that are hosted by the king. But yeah, there's definitely probably a graduation period to that as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned Henry VIII obviously was prevented from jousting. Now, I find that interesting because his elder brother Arthur died young. So I was curious, do we know if Arthur was allowed to joust, and then once Arthur died, Henry VII got one heir left? And sort of off the back of that as well, was Henry the same with Edward VI, or was Edward too young to even start thinking about jousting by the time that Henry died?
Yeah, I think that I think definitely for Edward VI, I think he was probably too young. There's no mention that we have of him training for tournaments or tilts, or there's nothing in the letters and papers that we have for his period on the British History Online. That's an interesting thing to look at. Something that I've not looked too much into with Edward. It tends to be noblemen that are continuing the tradition through Edward's reign and into Elizabeth. There are no tournaments in Edward's reign, probably because it was too short, but definitely Elizabeth. And it's the sons of those noblemen who are continuing that tradition forward. Edward isn't hosting any, we don't hear anything about him taking part. I think Henry, the young Henry, was definitely prevented. It's interesting. I think perhaps if Prince Arthur had survived, again, Arthur had a completely different personality to Henry VIII. He didn't have that same interest in wanting to be in tournaments that we know of later on. Although interestingly, the younger Henry was set off to join the church. So, there's that dimension to him as well. It's multifaceted, isn't it? But it's interesting to think about, if Arthur had survived, would Henry VII have allowed Henry VIII, the young Prince Henry, to take part in tournaments then? Who knows? But he's a bit, he's a bit mollycoddled in a way. He wants to kind of protect him. When Henry gets to the point where he's really interested and he's witnessing these events and he becomes of age to take part, Arthur's already passed away, so he's definitely prevented from doing so. Like I said, some people have thought, because they've misunderstood the quintain, thinking that was actual fighting, but no, he doesn't take part. And there's nothing to suggest that we don't have any evidence of Arthur taking part in any tournaments. The first one we get, the main tournament that we have, is at his wedding ceremony in 1501, and we do have some score checks from that. But the Duke of Buckingham organises that tournament in celebration of Prince Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and Arthur definitely doesn't compete at that event. He's just there as a host.
Yeah, no, interesting. We had on this topic of sort of childhood and upbringing and stuff like that, we had a couple of questions about the backgrounds of these, Charles Brand, because they're not presumably they're gentry, but what is their background and sort of how wealthy are they to be able to participate in jousting at this level? Yeah,
so they're not men of low status. They're definitely gentry level men from middling status backgrounds. Brandon comes to the attention of Henry at court because his uncle, Thomas Brandon, was a courtier of Henry VII, and he participated in tournaments in Henry VII's reign. And through his position, Brandon is able to build on that connection. So a lot of the time, it's about sort of that kingship of families, and different sons of gentrymen sort of pushing their sons forward, and into these households. So Brandon is sent to the Earl of Essex household to kind of, he's a seasoned jouster, to kind of get this training. And his uncle, Thomas Brandon, is already at court. His father, William Brandon, was the standard bearer for Edward IV, and he actually, he had died during the Wars of the Roses. So it's Thomas Brandon who really leads Brandon into court, Charles Brandon. But yeah, these are gentry level men. Nicholas Carew, again, Richard Carew had helped in Henry VII's wars, and he is placed in his son, Nicholas, he's placed in Henry VII's care, and he has that upbringing with Henry VIII. So again, he's in a really privileged position to be having that education. So yeah, you definitely, it's not, these are not men, even though they're not noble men, and we do get nobles, by the way, who do compete in tournaments. So it is still important to the noblemen as well. Chivalry is still an important factor. But yeah, you would have to have a degree of wealth because of the suits of armour. So if you think, a suit of armour might be an annual wage, for us back then, it might be somewhere between around, maybe it depended if it was etched, it depended if it had, had gold on there, anywhere from sort of £3 and £10, again, depending on the armour itself. But I mean, I guess modern day, that might be 5 to 8 years worth of rent for someone of low status. For us, it might be like going out and buying a jet or a yacht or something, like comparably. So you have to have a certain level of status, and also you couldn't be completely low status because Henry doesn't want to win against someone who's completely low status. So you have to have that degree, that kind of middling status.
Yeah, and on the subject of the cost as well, we had a question from Chris Smith about whether are people at the joust wearing normal armour, so the kind of stuff that you'd wear? Is it very much this highly decorated stuff that you see in our collections and a lot of our is almost?
Yeah, so it's difficult because we don't have a huge number of suits that survive from the period, and we rarely get in the accounts a really good description of if it was etched, if it was gilded. The suits that we have of Henry, I mean, there's one that I'm thinking of, I think it's in the Met Museum, you'll be able to correct me, from 1527. That one is gold and etched, and that's put down as a tournament suit. The one that you have in your collection from 1540, from the Greenwich tournament, again, is silver and embossed. The early ones that we see, so the 1515 one that I showed from Henry was believed to be field armour, the foot combat armour, that silver and engraved armour. I mean, that would have been used obviously for the cost of gold. So I guess it would depend. It would depend on your status and wealth. I'm presuming that noblemen's armour obviously would have been at the higher end. Those such as who are coming in from a middling status background would have had bespoke armour, obviously the right plating, but they would have had armour garniture as well, so they could have put different component parts on, so that you could maybe have one suit but then attach different parts on for the different stages of competition, so you weren't having to have 3 different sets of armour. So a lot of knights that you find have that, but it would just depend really. I guess the more etched and the more embossed it is, that in itself is a status symbol as well. So the armour themselves, the outward appearance becomes part of that status symbol.
I was going to say, presumably it's difficult for us to imagine it, but taste, I guess, is part of showing your masculinity and your culture, as well as just the raw physicality of the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely a fashion to it, and Henry draws a lot on kind of what's been done. That's why he has, when he sets up his own Greenwich workshop, it's like he doesn't have to keep importing armour from Italy, the Netherlands, Flanders. So he has all the armourists. The German armour is meant to be the top armourists, the Milanese armourers. So they all come over to Henry's workshop, and you definitely see a certain style coming out of the Greenwich workshops. Some have argued it's maybe more of a Renaissance style because it does become a bit more kind of embossed and golded. But I guess yeah, like I said, that is part of the fashion, the trend, and again, it's a status symbol. That's how you're identified, not just by what you're doing, but when you enter in, it's all part of that parade and performance.
Yeah. Staying on this topic of sort of international influence as well, we've had a couple of questions on: is Henry influenced at all by the Burgundian court, either in sort of, you know, terms of tournament practice, chivalry, anything along those lines?
Yeah, so Burgundy is a big influence across the continent, especially for the pass d'armes and how it becomes, there's that fantastical element. So Henry really likes the sort of the theatre aspect as well, and you get a lot of mass that happens. So a lot of these tournaments don't just happen as, right, we're going to have a tournament. They happen because there's like a romantic allegory surrounding it, where there's like a dress up, and there's a story, and it draws on these kind of romanticized mythical stories, and then that builds into then a tournament, so it becomes quite a big event. That's all come across from Burgundy, from this pass d'armes it's called, and that is about that kind of theatre of display, which builds into then what is then the action of the tournament. Edward IV was definitely influenced by that. That's when it really started coming across in the 15th century, when the tournament becomes a big, large-scale event rather than just a single combat. And especially because we get knights that go over to Burgundy to compete in these tournaments as well. I'm thinking in Edward IV's reign, we have as well Charles the Bold, who marries his sister. So you have that connection. And that definitely filters through. I mean, Maximilian I is a big influence for Henry, and he's really involved in that culture of chivalry. And the Order of the Golden Fleece, and we have the Order of the Garter. So we have these kind of replicated chivalric orders as well. So yeah, there's definitely a continental influence. And yeah, Maximilian I, I mean, you've got that amazing horned helmet at the Armouries, that's gifted to Henry. And that's clearly not a practical element. That's clearly about theatre and display. It's not being worn for jousting. So it builds into that culture. So yeah, there's definitely a flowering of chivalry that is happening in the late 15th century at the exact time that people are arguing it's in decline, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, and you know, we looked at some of the various different armours of Henry at different stages of his life, but after his injuries, is he still trying to demonstrate his masculinity in the same way?
So when
or does he manage to shift the way that he can bring across his masculinity?
Yeah, so so towards the end of his reign, there's a definite shift, because obviously Henry can't compete in tournaments, and we see that they drop off in the 1530s. So we don't have, there's quite a big gap before we have any that are held again. It's not till the 1540s that we seem to have them reappear. And again, it's only a few that come back. Henry isn't competing in them, but they are held. Henry goes, what I find really interesting is that Henry then goes to war with France at the end of his reign. So start and end of Henry's reign are pinpointed by war in France. And it's as if that, because you're in the tournament, it's so athletic, it's so demanding, and you have to have that agility, you have to have that particular physique. And that is for younger men, really. A lot of the men, even Brandon, retired for the tiltyard around 40. So I guess it's a bit like being an athlete today. There's clearly a stage in a man's life cycle where you're no longer suitable physically with your age for that level of competition. So I think Henry's way of kind of recuperating his masculinity is, well, I can't go and do tournaments. I can make war with France, and I can sit back. I don't have to be at the front. I can command from the back, which is what he does, and I can still be there as part of the action on the battlefield without being right at the front of it. And that's his way of kind of recuperating his masculinity. And that's why we see armour sets right up until sort of the early 1540s. We have that big armour set at the Met. And then interestingly, you've got one at the Royal Armouries from 1540, which is believed to be from a May Day Greenwich tournament, but Henry wasn't actually competing. So why he has it made, I'm not sure. It might be that he wants to sit there in armour, so he looks quite masculine still, and as if he's a part of that parade, but he actually doesn't compete in it, which is fascinating, which is Henry, I guess. Yeah, I think warfare is a way to recapture his masculinity later on.
And we've sort of talked a bit about Henry's injuries, but how much serious injury or death does there tend to be in the tournament?
So there's a few that I mentioned, like Francis Bryan, who had lost his eye, obviously Henry II of France. There's a few cases in Edward III's reign. He lost one of his closest companions in a jousting accident. There's possibly more accidents that happen than what we know about. I guess the main ones that we hear about, obviously it's going to be Henry's, that we all sort of we go back to because it's so well written about, because it's a king. But I think there's probably more than what I know about, because there haven't been as many that have been recorded. Or when we do get accidents, I've read accounts about tournaments that have taken place with sharp spears, we don't necessarily have knights that are often named as well. So it depends a lot of the time on the herald's accounts and how well detailed they are. What sometimes a bit disappointing about this area is that sometimes it might be like a single sentence or so with how they're treated. And it's not always that we get a real depth about the action. Like, the heralds don't always record exactly what was happening. Like, I would love to know a lot more detail than what they record. But I think accidents were still common. I think earlier on, when you don't have that tilt bar in Edward III's reign, there's more collisions because you've got nothing to prevent the horses. It's definitely more regulated in Henry's reign, but that's not to say, we clearly have evidence of accidents that happen, even to the king. And even today, was it on Time Team a few years ago, there was a serious jousting accident. So, even today we get men that are reenacting who suffer accidents in jousting. I know today we don't try and make hits on the head, it is just on the body, but yet we've had knights that have had serious accidents these days.
Yeah, and I guess another thing to pick up from that is, at this stage, it is assumed to be an accident, isn't it? So if you were to wound someone else in a joust, you wouldn't be punished. Yeah,
no. So it's presumed to be that you've made a missed hit. I mean, interestingly, in 1524, when Henry has that splinter to the face through his jousting helm, it's Brandon that does it. And there's this account where everyone's panicking, like, oh, what's going to happen? It's all kind of riding on how Henry's going to react towards Brandon. Now, perhaps if it had been someone else, maybe questions would have been raised, maybe things would have been treated differently. But because he has that close relationship with Brandon, I guess if you're entering that arena, you have to trust that the men in there are not going to kill you, that this is just part of the activity. And so when Edward IV was having tournaments in his reign, he had men that were jousting against him, that had fought against him during the Wars of the Roses, and he had to trust those men not to kill him. Henry enters and he has the accident with Brandon, and Brandon, it doesn't affect his position at all. It doesn't affect his relationship with Henry. He's let off, if you like, from causing the accident with Henry early on. So I think it's about the relationships that the men have with each other in that setting. And it was a closed off kind of club, if you like. They all had those bonds, and there must have been an element of trust there, that no one was kind of going in there to purposely harm someone else.
Because of course, I mean, you've compared it to Premier League football and stuff like that, but for someone like Charles Brandon, would he have gone to other tournaments in other courts in Europe and jousted there, or is his only interest really in royal favour and what he gets out of being that sort of narrow little clique of jousters?
Yeah, so it is about rising within the English court, and it is about proving yourself in that English hierarchy against other men who are your sort of direct competition. But also equally, Henry has these men go over to France and other parts of the continent to represent him in jousting contests, and that would have been an honour itself. So that says something as well about your status and ability and relationship with the king. So Brandon goes off and he acts as an ambassador, and he goes off with a few of the other jousting men, and they actually compete in joust in France. So obviously it's about then, I guess you're bringing across English masculinity, and you're saying, this is this is how well the English knights can perform. So I think it's important to recognise the stages within England, but also for Henry's rival, like Francis I, like at the Field of Cloth of Gold, for these men to say, right, this is what the English knights can do. A bit like the World Cup, really, when we kind of show off, this is what English football is, and this is what we can do over here. And you get a lot of that in Edward IV's reign as well. You get knights, because I do quite a lot of work on his as well. You get knights that will go off and fight in Burgundy, in the Burgundian court, the Pastons and the Anthony Woodvilles. And they'll go off and they'll represent English masculinity on behalf of that court and compete in tournaments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just one last question, if that's all right, before we go. For the people who've asked questions and haven't had the opportunity to get them answered, so if you've got a question such as, Peter, you'd like to know how many suits or horses were required for joust. Gillian, you had a question about how many inches should we allow for padding. Inquiries at armouries.org will get you to one of our curators, and they'll often be able to answer the sort of the practical questions about jousting armour and stuff like that. But Emma, for you, I had a kind of question about masculinity again, really. So royal favourites are never really very popular people, and often there are accusations of effeminacy or homosexuality levelled. So Hugh Despencer, Duke of Buckingham, people like that. Are any of those accusations ever levelled related to Henry? And if not, how do you think he avoided this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I looked at other favourites, and like you say, they're always written about poorly. And it's interesting because, the men that Henry competes with are the men that are part of his privy chamber, which is a closed off area for the king, and it's his most intimate living quarters. So like Henry Norris is a jouster, and he becomes a groom of the stool. So he's the king that's, the person that wipes the king's bum, which is not a thing we'd want to do. But yeah, it's such an intimate position because you're able to kind of whisper things in the king's ear. You're with him all the time. These men would sleep, eat and dress alongside the king, literally be in his bedchambers, and there's no whisperings or nothing criticised about the men that are in close contact with him or about Brandon. And I think it's because these men they operate just in that sphere. So you don't see Brandon trying to really interfere, I guess, with the Thomas Wolseys or the Cranmers. They're not part of that political sphere, or that the big religious things that are happening. They stick to that environment, or they stick, being buddies with the king, but they don't influence Henry negatively. And I think that's why, because it's able to kind of almost decompartmentalize where they sit. They don't come off in the same way. It's all the wives that are seen to get that attention, who, the Catherine Howards, the Anne Boleyns, they're seen to be the ones that are influencing the king. Whereas like the Alice Perez is the Edward III's, we don't get that with these other men, and there's no suggestion of anything, between these men. It is all about, it's homosocial bonding, but it's friendship. For all of them, there's no other suggestions.
Yeah, I suppose it's tricky with 6 wives. It's very difficult to level those sorts of accusations, but it's just an angle that I was curious that never come up. Yeah,
no, it's interesting to think of. Brandon's even, like I said, he's been heralded in papers as second king. You'd think, somebody was seen to challenge Henry and be called that, like when Wolsey has that rise to power and how that affects him. But it doesn't seem to affect with Brandon, and he survives as well. Very few men survive and have that close, intimate relationship with Henry and will survive across the whole reign. And Henry actually commissions his burial at St George's Chapel, so he is buried in the same chapel of Henry VIII, and no other courtiers, nobles from his court are, but Brandon is. So I find that really interesting as well.
Yeah, obviously a very significant relationship to Henry, one that meant a lot to him. So thank you very much, Emma, for today's lecture. Absolutely fascinating. Do you want to give a quick plug to your social media or anything like that before we go?
You can, if you want to hear any more, you can definitely follow me on Twitter. I'll often tweet about things that are upcoming. Recently, there was a Hem 8 series on Channel 5, and you'll see me on that if you YouTube it, and I'll speak a little bit about that on jousting if you want to see more of me. But yeah, thanks for today. Thanks for all the questions. And I just saw that someone, I think Chris, one of the panelists, said that they still do have hits on the head, which I didn't realise. I think at the Royal Armouries, it's just on the body. So I didn't realise you still did it on the head as well. So that's very impressive, dangerous.
Yeah, and I was going to say good luck to Chris with fitting your masculine body back into your armour for the next session. But yes, so just to reiterate, thank you, Emma, for today's lecture, and thank you to Robbie for producing the event behind the scenes, and thank you to the audience for taking time out of your day to attend, and for all the questions you had for the speaker. You know, unfortunately we couldn't get through them all, but as I said, any questions that you would like to ask our curators, they can go straight to inquiries@armouries.org.uk. So our next event is on the 4th of February, when our own Assistant Curator of Arms and Armour, Keith Dowen, is going to be speaking about the first archaeological find of the iconic early medieval kite shield and the light which this sheds on their construction and use. For details of this and for all our future events, keep an eye on our website, which is royalarmouries.org. Follow us on the social media network of your choice, and consider following us on Eventbrite to get notified when these events are going to happen. In the meantime, thank you again for spending time with us today, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. In the meantime, I will leave you with the closing slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you.